Born on May 5, 1949, Harold Morton was raised as the only son of a World War II veteran in Monterey, California. True to his military background, Harold's father embodied the strict, no-nonsense demeanor of a combat veteran, running his home with the discipline of a military barracks. He often shared stories of his time in battle, reminding his family, especially Harold, that he had shed enemy blood so they wouldn't have to. As a result, Harold's perception of the world was shaped by ideals of loyalty, discipline, and warfare. Given this upbringing, it might surprise you to learn that Harold grew up to be a socially adept and well-liked young man. While his father was firm, he was not cruel, and he instilled in Harold the social skills that led to his peers voting him most likely to succeed at Monterey Bay High School. However, in 1967, not long after graduation, one of Harold's closest friends was tragically killed in an accident. A drunk driver, recklessly speeding around a blind curve on a California highway, collided with him. The sudden and senseless nature of the event devastated Harold, plunging him into a deep depression from which he arguably never recovered. Within weeks of his friend Danny's passing, Harold created a small memorial in his bedroom, consisting of candles, a school photo, and some of Danny's belongings. When Harold's girlfriend discovered the shrine, she was deeply unsettled. Mourning a loved one was one thing, but Harold's fixation on his deceased friend bordered on obsessive. Her unease only grew when Harold confided in her, admitting he feared he might have been in love with Danny. Whether this was true or not remains uncertain, but despite his girlfriend's efforts to be understanding, Harold's overwhelming grief created a wedge between them. As his emotional turmoil deepened, Harold turned to marijuana and LSD in an attempt to self-medicate, hoping the hallucinogens might provide some clarity or relief. Instead, his drug use only widened the divide between him and his girlfriend, leading to their eventual breakup. His mental state continued to deteriorate, and by 1971, at just 22 years old, he followed his family's advice and voluntarily checked himself into a psychiatric hospital, hoping to receive proper treatment for his depression. However, because Harold's hospitalization was voluntary, he only remained under care for a short period. He cycled through several institutions, always expressing a desire to improve but never making any real progress. Eventually, he abandoned mental health treatment altogether, and his behavior took a dramatic and unsettling turn. Before long, he began exhibiting symptoms of severe paranoid schizophrenia. While living in a Monterey apartment, Harold's erratic behavior, such as pounding on the floor and shouting at imaginary figures, led to his eviction. Now homeless, he attempted to join the priesthood, but religious leaders quickly recognized something was disturbingly off about him and turned him away. By 1974, Harold, now 25, was arrested for vagrancy when a police officer found him burning his own skin with a cigarette. Clearly unable to care for himself, his parents took him back into their home in Carmel Valley. For a brief time, this appeared to have a stabilizing effect on him, but it soon became evident that Harold was merely refining his increasingly delusional worldview. Harold's birthday, May 5th, coincided exactly with the catastrophic 1905 earthquake that struck Northern California. The quake, measuring an estimated 7.8 on the Richter scale, caused widespread devastation, with tremors felt as far as the Central Valley. Reading about the disaster in his childhood seemed to leave a lasting impact on Harold's mind, forming the foundation of his increasingly unhinged beliefs. Over time, he became convinced that human sacrifice was necessary to appease a dark, subterranean force responsible for triggering earthquakes. He believed that without blood offerings, this ancient entity would continue to cause destruction. This idea solidified in Harold's mind when he compiled a timeline comparing major California earthquakes with American military conflicts. He noticed that during major wars, earthquake fatalities were significantly lower. The 1905 earthquake, for example, had occurred in a period of relative peace. But during World War I and World War II, earthquake-related deaths declined. The same pattern held for the Korean and Vietnam Wars, with seismic fatalities dropping to nearly nothing. However, in 1973, with U.S. military involvement in Vietnam winding down, the San Fernando Valley experienced a significant quake, causing dozens of casualties. To Harold, this was an unmistakable warning. a sign that sacrifices were needed to prevent future disasters. With this twisted logic in mind, Harold devised a plan to join the U.S. Marine Corps, hoping to contribute to a war effort that would satisfy the demands of the ancient force. He excelled in both physical and mental examinations, but was ultimately rejected due to his history of drug use. This rejection only fueled his paranoia. He began to believe he was the target of a vast conspiracy involving corrupt politicians and countercultural figures working in service of the evil force. His delusions soon turned violent. He fixated on an old high school acquaintance, Tom Guerrera, believing that Tom had deliberately led him astray by introducing him to marijuana. Harold tracked Tom to his remote cabin near Shadowbrook Road, only to find he had moved. The cabin's new occupant, a woman named Linda Foreman, unknowingly provided Harold with Tom's current address in Santa Clara. That night, Harold visited Tom's home, gaining entry under false pretenses before suddenly shooting him and his wife. He then desecrated their bodies before driving back to Linda's house, where he murdered her and her two young sons, 7-year-old Ryan and 5-year-old Luke. The murders severed Harold's connection to Tom, leading investigators to initially suspect that Linda's husband, who had criminal ties, was the intended target. Unbeknownst to them, Harold had already committed a series of other killings. He had beaten a homeless man to death with a baseball bat, believing the man to be a reincarnation of a biblical figure. He had also picked up a hitchhiking college student, whom he later stabbed and mutilated, scattering her remains along a hillside road. Despite these brutal crimes, Harold's visit to St. Anthony's Catholic Church suggests that he struggled with remorse. One evening, he entered a confessional booth where Father Lucien Tremont, a former French resistance fighter, was listening to confessions. Believing the priest wanted to volunteer as a sacrifice, Harold stabbed him to death on the spot before fleeing the church. Witnesses saw a tall man in dark clothing escaping the scene, but initial reports suggested the murder was a robbery gone wrong, slowing the investigation. Harold's final known murder occurred in March of 1974, when he randomly shot an elderly man trimming hedges outside his home in broad daylight. A witness was able to record Harold's license plate number, leading to his arrest just days later. When officers pulled him over, he was described as eerily calm, his rifle sitting in the passenger seat. During interrogation, Harold confessed in full detail, explaining that his actions had prevented major earthquakes. He cited the lack of significant seismic activity in California between October 1973 and March 1974 as proof. The Santa Clara district attorney charged him with multiple counts of murder, and his trial began in September 1974. The key question was whether Harold was legally sane. The prosecution pointed to his calculated methods and attempts to cover his tracks, while the defense emphasized his history of severe schizophrenia. Ultimately, Harold was convicted, receiving life sentences for 2 premeditated murders and lesser sentences for his more impulsive killings. He was denied parole multiple times, remaining incarcerated for decades. And yet, just 11 days after Harold was arrested, a 5.9 magnitude earthquake struck the California coast, causing significant property damage. To most, it was merely coincidence, but to Harold, it was validation, a sign that his horrific sacrifices had truly kept the disaster at bay. So was Harold Morton simply a deranged killer, or did he truly understand something that the rest of us don't? Something lurking beneath the earth, waiting for its due? In July of 1975, the affluent, all-American Patterson family from Oakwood, a suburb of Chicago, were spending their summer at their lakeside retreat near Lake Huron, just north of Harbor Springs. The couple, Tom and Linda, had built their fortune through a successful publishing and marketing business, and over their nearly 20-year marriage, they had raised 4 children: 20-year-old Michael, 17-year-old Kevin, 13-year-old Brian, and 8-year-old Lisa. To those who knew them, the Pattersons seemed like the perfect example of a prosperous and happy modern family. However, beneath their seemingly ideal life lay a series of dark secrets, some more sinister than others. Tom's latest business venture, an arts magazine, was struggling financially, and his overall financial situation was beginning to crumble. Bills were left unpaid, bank accounts showed unusual activity, and investors were beginning to question whether Tom Patterson would ever return their money. Additionally, a disturbing pattern had emerged at Tom's office, where a revolving door of secretaries had resigned over the past decade, many leaving within months of being hired. The work environment was described as unsettling, with Tom's inappropriate behavior toward female employees being a common complaint. He had a habit of asking women to hike up their skirts so he could touch their bare legs, a fact that Linda remained completely unaware of. As the family traveled to their summer retreat, a log and stone cabin named Cedar Haven, located a half-mile west of the main road, Linda had no inkling of the horror that awaited them. About a month after the Pattersons had settled in, the caretaker responsible for maintaining summer homes in the area started receiving complaints about a terrible odor coming from the Patterson property. When he arrived, he found the windows and doors securely locked and assumed the family had left some food out or that a plumbing issue had occurred. Knowing the Pattersons would want their property well maintained, the caretaker carefully forced entry into the home. What he discovered inside haunted him for the rest of his life. The first thing he noticed, besides the overwhelming stench, was the suffocating heat. The summer had been unrelenting, and despite the absence of central heating, the house was unbearably hot. He then saw the body of Linda Patterson. The heat had accelerated decomposition, leaving a grisly scene. She was lying face down, partially covered by a plaid blanket, with blood pooling beneath her from a single gunshot wound to the head. Tom was found nearby, sprawled across a heating vent. He had been shot multiple times, once with the same .25 caliber weapon that had killed his wife and another with what was later determined to be a .22 caliber rifle. Additionally, he had suffered severe head trauma. His skull cracked open, exposing its gruesome contents. Panicked, the caretaker rushed outside, vomited, and immediately called the police. When officers arrived, they found 13-year-old Brian lying on top of his father, executed in a similar manner to his mother, with a single bullet to the head. The young boy had also been partially covered with a blanket. 8-year-old Lisa's body was discovered nearby. She had multiple gunshot wounds and a fractured skull, suggesting she had also been beaten with a blunt object. The two oldest boys, Michael and Kevin, were found in a bedroom. Both had been shot several times in the head with a .25 caliber pistol. Kevin, the 17-year-old, had also been shot in the back with a .22 rifle, indicating he may have been trying to flee. Forensic analysis suggested that the murderer had approached the cabin from a distance, observing the family before taking the first shot through a window. Once the initial attack was underway, the killer forced entry through the back door, methodically hunting down the remaining family members. After the murders, they drew the curtains, turned up the heat, and covered the broken window with cardboard. The presence of only a single set of bloody footprints suggested the work of a lone killer, one who was meticulous enough to leave behind little evidence. The bodies had gone undiscovered for nearly a month, and due to the advanced state of decomposition, the exact date of death was difficult to determine. Investigators believed it was a carefully planned and well-executed crime, possibly carried out by someone with previous experience. The last people to see the Pattersons alive were two tree trimmers hired by Tom to clear branches around the cabin. Neighbors recalled hearing loud noises and shouting in late June, but they dismissed the sounds, assuming they were from nearby hunters. Given Tom's financial troubles, investigators focused on the possibility of a disgruntled business partner or a client with a grudge. This led them to question a man named Robert Mancini, a 32-year-old former military man who had worked for Patterson's marketing firm since the mid-1960s. Detectives quickly noticed inconsistencies in his statements. Further investigation revealed that Mancini had been embezzling large sums of money from the company. Though this alone did not directly connect him to the murders, it made him a prime suspect. It was later discovered that Mancini had recently purchased two firearms, a .25 caliber automatic pistol and a .22 caliber rifle, from a local gun shop. These were the exact calibers used in the killings. Investigators also learned that Mancini's father-in-law owned a shooting range, which led them to search the facility. There, they found shell casings identical to those recovered from the Patterson cabin. Despite this compelling evidence, prosecutors hesitated to press charges. Mancini had an alibi that, while questionable, could not be entirely disproven. Additionally, the murder weapons were missing, and his fingerprints were not found at the scene. However, in 1971, a new district attorney took office and reopened the case, believing he could secure a conviction. But on March 5, 1972, before any formal charges could be filed, Mancini took his own life using the same .25 caliber pistol believed to have been used in the Patterson murders. He left behind a blood-stained typewritten note that read, "I am a liar, a thief, and a fraud." He listed several people he had swindled over the years and included a handwritten addition addressed to his mother. "I had nothing to do with the Pattersons. I'm a liar, but I'm not a killer. I'm sick and terrified. God and everyone, please forgive me." Because state law did not allow an open homicide case to be closed without a conviction, the Patterson murders were classified as inactive. Over the years, both amateur and professional investigators have proposed theories and named alternate suspects, but none have been definitively proven. Those who knew Tom Patterson personally insisted he was a devoted husband, father, and businessman. They struggled to understand why anyone would target him and his family in such a brutal fashion. Some doubted Mancini's involvement, believing him to be a con artist who got caught up in something much darker. But with each passing year, the likelihood of finding the true killer fades. It remains entirely possible that someone, somewhere, lived out the rest of their life knowing they had mercilessly gunned down an entire family, including fleeing children, and completely got away with it. Whatever I encountered seemed to follow me, as I noticed the same strange presence at my father's house after moving in with him. But that's another story. Nowadays, when I visit my mom's home, I don't feel any heavy energy or bad presence. My dad's house, however, still carries a sense of unease, especially in the basement. The man who never left. This story was told to me by a friend, and even today it sends chills down his spine when he recalls it. Through this tale, we'll be transported to a distant yet picturesque place. For privacy reasons, I won't mention the specific town, but I will say it's a small yet well-known town in Greece, a place my friend has visited frequently since childhood. The encounter took place around 11 years ago, during the summer when my friend, whom I'll call Kieran, was still a carefree kid. Every summer, when school let out, Kieran and his parents would travel to that town to visit his grandmother, who lived alone in a modest yet well-kept house on the outskirts. Over the years, Kieran had grown close to many kids in the town, but one in particular stood out. Let's call him Jason. Kieran and Jason spent their summers like most kids do, playing in the town square, pulling harmless pranks on locals, and creating the kind of memories that define childhood. But one particular memory would stand out above the rest, not because it was funny or thrilling, but because it spoke of something unexplainable, something beyond this world. Roughly 80 years ago, a terrible event occurred in this very town during the early days of Greece's involvement in World War II. In December of that year, the German forces carried out brutal attacks across the region, destroying villages, setting fire to homes, and taking innocent lives. When they reached this town on December 13, 1943, they gathered the residents at the local school, separating the women and children from the men and boys over the age of 12. The men and older boys were marched to a hillside just outside of town and, in a horrifying act of cruelty, were executed by machine gun fire. Only a handful managed to survive by playing dead or escaping. Nearly 500 people perished in mere moments. After the massacre, the soldiers set fire to the town, reducing buildings, including the school, to ashes. Miraculously, the women and younger children managed to escape the flames. The survivors were left to pick up the pieces, bury their loved ones, and rebuild from the devastation. To honor those lost, a monument was later built on the hill where the massacre took place. To Kieran, the hill was always a peaceful place. It overlooked the town, surrounded by lush greenery. He visited it often, sometimes in the late hours. In a small town like this, there weren't many restrictions on children roaming freely, so he and Jason took full advantage of their freedom. During the final days of Kieran's summer visit, he and Jason decided to do something daring: visit the hill at night. Kieran's parents weren't particularly strict, so a curfew wasn't an issue for him. Jason's parents, on the other hand, might have objected, but Jason didn't seem concerned. Sneaking out was easy enough. As the two boys made their way up the hill under the night sky, the town's outskirts were eerily silent. No cars, no people, just the sound of their own footsteps. The quiet filled Kieran with a sense of excitement. But as they reached the hill, that excitement disappeared. An unsettling feeling took its place. Jason, usually full of chatter, had gone quiet too. The silence stretched on, making Kieran feel uneasy. It was as if they weren't alone. The hill was always open to visitors, but who else would be there at this hour? They weren't trespassing, yet something felt off. Then Kieran saw it. A man, walking slowly but purposefully towards them. His clothes were simple, but his hat looked like something out of an old photograph, the kind Kieran's grandfather used to wear. The boys stood frozen as the figure approached. He looked like any regular man, but what was he doing here so late at night? Before Kieran could process his thoughts, Jason grabbed his arm and shouted, "Run!" The two boys bolted down the hill, their hearts pounding. By some miracle, they didn't trip or fall as they dashed through the darkness. When they reached the bottom, they turned back. The man hadn't followed them. Who was that? Jason asked between gasps. I don't know, Kieran replied, still shaken. The next morning, Jason was back to his usual self, laughing and talking as if nothing had happened. But later that day, he turned to Kieran with a mischievous grin. "Want to go back there tonight?" Kieran hesitated. He wanted to call his friend crazy, but deep down, a part of him was drawn back to the hill. "Fine," he agreed. That night, they returned, more cautious than before. When they reached the top, Jason pointed. The man was there again, sitting in the grass, staring out over the town. Taking a deep breath, Jason called out, "Hello? Do you work here?" The man turned to them, his face calm but his eyes carrying a deep sorrow. "I've worked everywhere around here," he answered simply. The response was odd, detached, as if he didn't truly belong yet had nowhere else to go. The boys exchanged nervous glances. "Are you from this town?" Jason asked. "I've always been here," the man replied, looking back toward the town, his gaze distant. A shiver ran through Kieran. Something felt wrong. "We should go," he whispered to Jason, taking a step back. Jason hesitated but eventually agreed. As they retreated, the man spoke one last time. "I need to get back to my wife and children soon." Kieran's blood ran cold. His heart pounded as he hurried away. Jason followed. When they reached the bottom of the hill, neither spoke. Even Jason, always full of jokes, had nothing to say. The next morning, Kieran told his grandmother about the experience. She looked at him with concern. "Why did you go up there so late? What did you see?" When he described the man, his grandmother's face darkened. "There's no caretaker up there. No one would be on that hill at night." Kieran felt his stomach drop. Then, who was he? His grandmother sighed. The men who died there had families, homes, dreams. Everything was taken from them so suddenly, so unfairly. Some souls never find peace. She didn't dismiss his story. She didn't tell him it was just his imagination. Instead, her words confirmed what Kieran already feared. That man, whoever he was, had never truly left. And perhaps, he never could. Beyond that eerie doorway or sorrowful monument. Enjoy? Send me your spine-chilling tales of the unknown at darktales.net and check out my other podcasts at hauntingechoes.com for more terrifying content. ####the thing in the crawl space. From Ethan. When I was a kid, about 11 years old, my parents arranged for us to spend 4 nights in a wooden cabin somewhere in Oregon with my grandpa. What happened there left me shaken forever. The crisp evening air brushed against my face as I stepped out of the car. I gazed at the dense trees surrounding us before heading toward the cabin. My mom called out behind me, "Ethan, honey, go put your things away in your room." As I pushed open the cabin door, I was met with a loud creak. Inside was a spacious area with a couch facing a mounted television. The kitchen was part of the open living space, with a row of stools lining the counter. I walked up the stairs, passing a small bathroom, and entered the room assigned to me. The moment my eyes landed on the floor, I let out a scream. There, in the middle of the room, was a lifeless squirrel. It looked like something had chewed on it, its insides smeared across the wooden planks. Panicked, I ran down the stairs just as my father was pushing my grandpa's wheelchair inside. "Dad, there's a dead squirrel in my room," I practically yelled.
My dead side.
"You're old enough. Just clean it up." So reluctantly, I did. I went through nearly an entire roll of paper towels and a bottle of disinfectant to deal with it. By the time I finished, it was around 6:30 p.m., and my mom had prepared macaroni and cheese with diced sausage, my favorite back then. As I carried my bowl to the couch where Grandpa sat, something unusual caught my eye. A square hatch sat right in the middle of the room, nearly blending with the floorboards. "Mom, what's this door for?" I asked. "Probably leads to the crawl space," she replied. "Cabins like these use them to prevent flooding." Satisfied with her answer, I sat down and turned on the TV, focusing on my meal. The night went on, and soon it was time for bed. My dad had told me earlier about all the fishing and canoeing we'd do, and I was eager for the morning. Wrapped in warm blankets, I drifted off to sleep quickly. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a shuffling noise. I sat up, listening. The sound was faint but distinct. Curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped out of my room, leaving the door slightly ajar. The hallway was dimly lit by moonlight, casting long shadows that moved with the trees outside. The shuffling continued, so I slowly crept down the stairs. I pressed my ear to the wooden floor. My heart pounded as I realized the noises were coming from beneath me, under the floorboards. A cold wave of dread washed over me. Something was moving down there. Despite my fear, my foolish curiosity won. Grabbing a flashlight, I pried open the hatch. The second it opened, a dozen mice scurried away into the darkness. The space beneath was vast and damp, resembling a maze. I don't know if I was incredibly brave or just plain reckless, but I crawled forward, deeper into the cramped passage. About 10 feet ahead, I noticed movement. I instinctively flicked on the flashlight. What I saw made my stomach drop. A hunched figure with elongated limbs and ghostly pale skin crouched in the shadows. Its eyes reflected the light, glowing unnaturally bright. I was frozen in place as the thing let out a horrid screech. The flashlight must have startled it. That's when I turned and bolted. I crawled as fast as I could, but the creature was faster. I dared one glance behind me. Big mistake. The thing was crawling after me, its bony fingers gripping the wooden beams to propel itself forward. It had been eating the mice, I realized. The dead squirrel in my room must have been one of its leftovers. And if it could do that to a small animal, I shuddered to think what it could do to me. Every passing second, it gained on me. My hands and knees scraped against the dirt and wood, but I didn't stop. Just as I was beginning to think I'd never make it, I spotted the hatch above. I lunged upward, pushing the door open with all my strength. Just as I scrambled out, I felt something grab at my ankle. I kicked wildly, yanked myself free, and slammed the hatch shut. The thing thrashed against it from below, clawing and banging. I threw my weight over it, pressing down with everything I had. Then, after what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I didn't waste a second. I sprinted upstairs to my parents' room and pounded on the door. "Dad! Mom!" I screamed. My father groggily opened the door, rubbing his eyes. "Ethan, what's wrong?" "There's something in the house. We need to leave." He looked unimpressed, half asleep. "You had a nightmare. Go back to bed." I tried explaining, but he wouldn't listen. Frustrated and terrified, I had no choice but to return to my room. I didn't sleep a second that night. Morning came. I forced myself to eat breakfast and joined my dad for a fishing trip on the lake. Being out on the water helped me forget, even if only for a little while. I didn't catch anything, but I was just grateful to be far from the cabin. As the day turned to evening, we roasted marshmallows by the fire. Grandpa and Mom reminisced about past camping trips, laughing over old stories. My s'mores were perfectly gooey, but the thought of nightfall unsettled me. When bedtime came, I was terrified that the creature would return. I told myself I wouldn't sleep, but at some point, exhaustion took over. A noise woke me, a slow, deliberate creak. The trap door was opening. My chest tightened with fear. I could hear the kitchen cupboards slamming shut, one after another. The thing was searching for me. The floorboards groaned as footsteps moved closer. I held my breath. Was my door locked? Could it even open doors? My mind raced, then scratching at my door. The handle jiggled. Everything fell silent. Then another sound, a door opening. My dad's voice boomed, "Get out of here!" A blood-curdling shriek erupted, followed by the sound of shattering glass. I jumped from my bed, yanked my door open, and saw my dad standing outside his room, gripping his fishing knife. To my right, a trail of blood led to a shattered window. That night, we packed up and left. In the summer of 1979, Susan Reeves and her 5 children left their home in New Jersey and moved to a quiet mountain town in Northern California, escaping the violent outbursts of her abusive husband, Michael. They settled in a modest cabin in the peaceful town of Cedar Ridge, believing they had finally found a safe place to call home, free from fear. On the morning of April 11th, 1981, Susan, her 14-year-old daughter Shannon, and her 5-year-old son Garrett were returning from a friend's house. They stopped at the local baseball field to pick up 10-year-old Robbie and coincidentally came across 15-year-old Jason, who was hitchhiking home with his friend Daniel. After lunch, Shannon planned to spend the night at the neighboring Simmons family home, while Susan remained at the cabin with Robbie, Garrett, and the boy's friend Justin. Shannon left around 8 p.m., leaving her mother alone with the younger children. Her 12-year-old sister, Tina Reeves, briefly joined her at the Simmons house but returned home to sleep around 9:30 p.m. None of them knew that this would be the last night their family would be together, as a terrifying and tragic event was about to unfold. The next morning, April 12th, Shannon returned home from her sleepover to a scene that would haunt her forever. The lifeless bodies of her older brother Jason and his friend Daniel lay on the living room floor, bound with electrical tape. Susan had been gagged with a cloth and brutally attacked. 2 knives and a hammer were found at the crime scene, with one of the knives so violently used that the blade was bent at a sharp angle. Blood patterns in the home indicated that all the murders had occurred in the living room. The perpetrator had even arranged the victims' bodies in a grotesque display. Susan was discovered near the couch, partially unclothed. She had been stabbed in the chest, and her throat had been slashed so deeply that it severed her windpipe and nicked her spine. A distinct imprint on her head matched the butt of an air rifle, suggesting she had been struck with it. Jason and Daniel had suffered severe skull fractures from a claw hammer, while Jason also had a large wound on his throat. Bruising around Daniel's neck suggested he had been strangled instead of stabbed. Shannon then went upstairs and found that the younger children, Robbie, Garrett, and Justin, were unharmed, but her younger sister Tina was missing. Neither Shannon nor the Simmons family had heard anything unusual that night. However, a couple living in a nearby cabin reported being woken at 1:15 a.m. by muffled screaming. Along with Tina's disappearance, some of her belongings, including her jacket, shoes, and a toolbox, were missing. There were no signs of forced entry. The phone had been left off the hook, and the curtains were drawn, leading investigators to suspect that the victims knew their killer, who had attempted to cover his tracks before leaving. One early suspect was a man who had abruptly left Cedar Ridge after the murders and was later found in Oregon. However, after passing a polygraph test, he was ruled out. Another suspect, the father of young Justin, claimed that a claw hammer had been stolen from his home, which made him a person of interest. Yet, as the investigation continued, authorities also ruled him out. Justin later gave conflicting accounts of the night, one of which he described as a dream. Under hypnosis, he recalled waking up to strange noises and seeing Susan with 2 men, one with a mustache and short hair, the other clean-shaven with longer hair. He claimed Jason and Daniel entered the room and began arguing with the intruders. He also recounted seeing Tina being taken out of the back door of the cabin, never to return. Investigators spent thousands of hours on the case, but progress was slow. Some officers described their efforts as frustrating and fruitless. Theories that the killings were connected to cult activity or drug trafficking were dismissed due to a lack of evidence. However, a family acquaintance later told police that Daniel had recently stolen a supply of hallucinogenic drugs from local dealers, though this claim was never confirmed. Desperate for answers, investigators even considered the possibility that serial killers Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole were responsible, but this theory was ruled out by late 1983. Meanwhile, the FBI initially led a kidnapping investigation into Tina's disappearance but eventually left the case to local authorities, who found no leads despite extensive searches with search dogs. Then, on April 22, 1984, more than 3 years after the murders, a bottle collector stumbled upon a human skull fragment and jawbone near Feather Creek, over 100 miles from Cedar Ridge. Shortly after the discovery was announced, an anonymous caller informed the sheriff's office that the remains belonged to Tina. For reasons unknown, this call was never documented in the case file. A forensic pathologist later confirmed that the bones belonged to Tina. Nearby, investigators also found a blue jacket, a blanket, a pair of jeans, and an empty roll of surgical tape. The case went cold for many years until a 2008 documentary reignited interest. In it, Marilyn Smart, Justin's mother, alleged that her ex-husband Martin and his friend Bo were responsible for the killings. She recalled waking up around 2 a.m. on the night of the crime to see the two men burning something in their fireplace. She also claimed Martin despised Jason. However, the sheriff at the time insisted Martin had passed a polygraph and was not considered a suspect. Bo, who had alleged ties to organized crime in Chicago, died in the late 1980s. The case took another turn in 2016 when authorities discovered a hammer in a local pond that matched the description of the one Martin claimed had been stolen. A county sheriff stated that it appeared to have been deliberately placed there rather than accidentally lost. Investigators then identified 6 potential suspects, including Martin Smart. Marilyn later revealed that Martin had abruptly left town after the murders and moved to Reno, Nevada. From there, he had mailed her a letter mentioning their marital issues, which chillingly ended with, "I paid the price for your love, and now I've bought it with 4 lives." A counselor who had worked with Martin also came forward, claiming that Martin had confessed to killing Susan and Tina, but insisted he had nothing to do with the boys. He allegedly stated that Tina was killed because she had witnessed everything. In April 2018, investigators announced that DNA evidence from a piece of tape found at the crime scene matched a living suspect. This shocking development suggests that the mystery of the Cedar Ridge murders may finally be solved, though the truth behind the killings could reveal something even more sinister. The case remains one of the most disturbing unsolved crimes in California's history. For now, the community waits, hoping for justice at last. Strange enough, since then, I haven't seen or heard anything unusual, but thinking about those 3 incidents still fills me with unease. I keep telling myself there's no way something like a shapeshifter exists in my quiet coastal town, yet a small part of me still wonders if it's possible. My ex's attachment from the haunted echo. I want to begin by mentioning that this story contains some distressing topics, including domestic violence, assault, and harm toward animals. I apologize for the length, but a lot of details are necessary to make sense of everything. I'm a 21-year-old woman, and when I was 19, I had just ended a 3-year relationship that consumed much of my teenage years. Being young and not fully understanding relationships, I quickly turned to dating apps. Within a few weeks, I met my now ex-boyfriend. At first, he seemed wonderful. He had a stable job, admired my gothic style, was willing to go out with me, and acted like a gentleman. I know that's just the basics, but since I had never experienced that before, I fell for it. He was 23 years old, and let's call him Jake. Things moved fast, and I started going over to Jake's place early in the relationship. That's when things started feeling off. I've always been a spiritual person and have had many paranormal or unexplainable experiences. My childhood home had an eerie presence, though my mother would never admit it. I was used to strange atmospheres, but when I stepped into his house, the energy felt overwhelming, heavy, unwelcoming. At first, I chalked it up to nerves, but that explanation wouldn't hold for long. Things in the house frequently moved on their own, and I often got blamed for losing items. Objects would end up in strange places, under furniture, in the dishwasher, on the far side of counters. At times, I thought maybe the dog was responsible, but that didn't explain how things wound up under the couch or inside cabinets. Over time, I noticed that the hallway outside his bedroom was unnaturally cold compared to the rest of the house. It gave me a deep sense of unease, to the point that I started running past his room because of how uncomfortable I felt. I would see shadowy figures standing in the hall or strange shapes peeking around the doorway. This was confirmed when I was home alone. The dog refused to leave my side. She would sit close to me, growling and barking at what appeared to be nothing, always just outside the door, like she was protecting me. Eventually, I started shutting the door, which seemed to calm her slightly, but she never stopped being on alert. If Jake caught her acting this way, he would hit her, shove her, or yell at her to be quiet. But I never believed it was nothing. One day, I mentioned it to his mother, and she told me she believed Jake's grandparents were present in the house. She had experienced similar occurrences and reassured me that they wouldn't harm anyone. That explanation settled my nerves for a while, but in time, things took a much darker turn. As time passed, I started having terrifying nightmares while staying there. Dreams of something hurting my niece or nephew, dreams of being watched. I also began experiencing sleep paralysis regularly, something I hadn't dealt with in years. The paranormal activity seemed to escalate alongside Jake's growing abusive behavior. One night, when things were reaching their worst, I was in a deep sleep when something suddenly grabbed me. It yanked me hard, leaving bruises on my arm, as if trying to drag me out of bed. I woke up in terror, crying uncontrollably. I shook Jake awake, but he only yelled at me to go back to sleep and stop being ridiculous. Eventually, after calming down, I drifted back to sleep, only to wake up an hour later to the most horrifying sight. Standing over Jake's side of the bed was an unnaturally tall man, towering over us. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit and wore a bowler hat. His arms hung at his sides, extending past his knees, his fingers long and bony. First, it just stood there, staring at me. Then it reached out its hand as if to grab me. Panicked, I scrambled backward on the bed, pressing against the wall in fear. As it moved closer, I could feel its fingers graze my arm, and I started screaming, sobbing uncontrollably. The figure loomed even closer. Jake finally woke up, turning on the light, and in an instant, the figure was gone. It felt as if it was trying to force me out, to make me leave that house, as if it wanted me gone. I slept with the lights on for the rest of the night. Not long after that, Jake sexually assaulted me. I eventually escaped, got a restraining order against him, and pressed charges. He was convicted. It was an incredibly traumatic experience. After I left, I never saw the figure again. No more nightmares, no more feelings of dread. Nothing. The relationship with Jake lasted just under 6 months, and during that time, I endured severe abuse. He isolated me from my family, frequently threw things at me, drove erratically to frighten me, and manipulated me into staying. He gaslighted me, attempted to cut me off from my friends, and, of course, sexually assaulted and blackmailed me. Even after I left, he stalked and harassed me, refusing to let go. This gives some insight into the kind of person Jake was. To this day, I still don't have a clear answer for what I experienced, but I do believe Jake had something attached to him. As time has passed, I wonder if it wasn't trying to hurt me at all. Maybe it was trying to push me away, to scare me into leaving before worse things happened. Maybe it knew what was coming and felt the only way to protect me was to frighten me out of there. Or maybe it was just a manifestation of what my instincts already knew. We grabbed our belongings and left the cabin in silence. Since then, my family has avoided the woods completely. Stay as safe as you can, everyone. If you ever hear strange noises in an unfamiliar place, don't hesitate to leave or call for help. You never know what might be lurking nearby or even beneath you. Hashtag the shape in the shadows, a coastal encounter. My name is Sarah, and I'm a 30-year-old woman living in a coastal town in Northern California. I share a 2-bedroom apartment with my roommate and her cat. Our town is bordered by the ocean on one side and rolling hills on the other, with a network of dry riverbeds running through the area. We live near the town center, just behind an old, run-down motel. Locals whisper that a serial killer in the late 1970s used to stay there and reportedly kept body parts in the bathtub. Between the motel and our apartment is a fenced-off, overgrown lot that we jokingly call the Creeper's Patch. It's full of tangled bushes, a few scraggly trees, and plenty of places where small animals, or even drifters, could hide without anyone noticing. A narrow walkway cuts through the lot, snaking between our building and the one behind us, passing right by our bathroom window. The window is too high to see into from the outside, standing at about 6 feet off the ground. Despite that, I always get an eerie feeling when I pass by the Creeper's Patch, especially after dark. I don't usually use cannabis, but one night, when I was sore after a long weekend, my roommate gave me an edible. That night, I dreamed of something hunting me, a creature lurking just beyond my vision. I woke up with my heart racing, telling myself it was just the THC playing tricks on me. After that night, I didn't have any more dreams about it. One evening, when my roommate was out of town, her cat slept in my room with me. At around 4 a.m., we both woke up to a loud, repetitive beeping, just like a smoke alarm going off. The sound was sharp, and for a moment, I was convinced the apartment was on fire. I sat up, drenched in sweat, but by then, the noise had stopped abruptly. I got up to investigate, expecting to see smoke or even flames outside. But when I peered out the living room window, the only thing I saw was a completely white cat I'd never seen before. It sat eerily still, staring into the Creeper's Patch. Something about it made me uneasy. I held my breath, watching the unmoving cat, until my roommate's cat brushed against my leg, rolling onto his back. I looked down briefly to pet him, and when I looked back up, the white cat was gone. I scanned the lot for it, but it had disappeared. After confirming there was no fire, I returned to bed, but I couldn't get warm for the rest of the night. The odd thing was, before waking up, I had felt too hot. The next day, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something wasn't quite right. A few weeks later, I noticed that a section of the fence around the lot had been bent down, low enough for a cat or a very thin person to slip underneath. About a month after that, around 8:30 p.m., I let my roommate know I'd be taking a shower in case she wanted to use the bathroom first. I left the door unlocked so the cat could come in to use the litter box if needed. While I was rinsing the shampoo from my hair, I heard a knock, muffled but distinct. I assumed it was from the bathroom door. I pulled the shower curtain back slightly and called out, "What's up? It's me," came the response, in what sounded like my roommate's voice, but just a little off. We often used exaggerated voices when joking around, so I didn't think much of it. Figuring the cat wanted in, I reached over and pulled the door open, but there was nothing there. I stood frozen in the steam-filled bathroom, heart pounding. After a long moment, I shut the door again, my mind racing. What the hell had just happened? When I came out, I asked my roommate if she had knocked. She looked up from the couch, confused, and said no. She hadn't moved since I went in. I believed her. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like something unseen was watching. The next morning, I had a horrible realization. The knock could have come from the bathroom window, not the door. The final incident happened a few weeks ago, just 2 weeks from today. As I was settling into bed, I heard someone shouting outside my window. A desperate, pleading voice called out, "Help me! Someone, please help me." The voice sounded wrong. The words repeated again and again, like a broken record. At first, it seemed distant, but gradually it got closer. By the time it sounded like it was coming from the street corner near my apartment, I hesitated, then looked outside. Nothing, but the voice didn't stop. I wasn't the only one who heard it. A few neighbors stepped outside, scanning the darkened street, calling out to ask if someone needed help. I called 911 to report a distressed person, then kept watching from my window. Eventually, the neighbors, seeing nothing, went back inside. But I waited. Then I saw something. A figure, far in the distance, moved beneath a flickering streetlight. The way it walked unsettled me. It wasn't quite a limp, but something was off about its movements. I couldn't make out any defining features, not even a height estimate. But I knew one thing: I didn't want to know what it was. That was enough for me. I turned off my light, pulled the blankets over myself, and tried to sleep while keeping my ears open. I haven't seen or heard anything like that since, but I haven't stopped watching either. If I had paid attention, maybe I could have avoided everything. But who knows? The lesson here is to be cautious about who you trust. If you're with someone and your gut tells you to leave, whether it's intuition or something else, trust it and get out. This happened during Halloween in 1985 in a small town outside Philadelphia. It was my first year of high school, and this is the only experience of its kind that I've ever had. The story involves my friends Mike and Dan. I'm using different names to keep their identities private. That Halloween night, we had just finished freshman football practice. We were 14 or 15 at the time, typical suburban kids from Pennsylvania. We were at that awkward age where we felt too old to wear costumes and go trick-or-treating, but we still wanted free candy. So, we put on our football jerseys and went door to door, pretending it was our team uniform. Mike had very little supervision at home. He had long hair and girls liked him. He acted like nothing ever bothered him. Dan and I, on the other hand, came from more structured homes with rules and expectations, not that I was great at following them. Mike always seemed cooler than us, wearing a leather jacket and being allowed to smoke in his house. In our small circle, he was the leader. We were all into heavy metal at the time, bands like Black Sabbath, Iron Maiden, Ozzy Osbourne, and Dio. We loved the so-called dark themes in the music and thought it made us seem rebellious. We even played Led Zeppelin records backward, searching for hidden messages. Kids from the 80s will understand. Mike once made a metal cross in shop class, and sometimes he'd wear it upside down, calling himself Johnny Blade after a Black Sabbath song. That night, after collecting candy, we ended up at Dan's house, in his parents' bedroom for some reason. It was the first and last time I ever went into that room. The bedroom was located on the main floor of their Cape Cod-style house, right off the living room. As we sorted through our candy, the clock radio on the nightstand suddenly turned on. We laughed it off at first and kept talking. Then the lights started flickering. Mike saw this as some kind of sign, and since it was Halloween, he decided to bless the room with his crude, handmade cross. Dan and I were sitting on the bed while Mike moved around, holding the cross upside down. He went over to the clock first. "I bless you in the name of..." Well, I don't even want to say it, even now, almost 40 years later. Then he moved toward the flickering light and did the same thing. Finally, he noticed a crucifix hanging above the bedroom door and walked toward it. As soon as he raised the cross to speak, I swear, I saw him lift off the ground, at least 3 feet, and then get thrown backward, landing on Dan and me. He had been flung more than 5 feet. Terrified, I bolted out into the hallway. The lights were flashing wildly, and the radio was blasting static. Then, I saw something even worse. Mike looked like he was choking on his own tongue. Dan immediately jumped on him, sticking his fingers in Mike's mouth to stop him from swallowing it. But Mike kept gagging. I was frozen in fear, inching back into the room while his eyes rolled back in his head. The lights and radio were still going crazy, and then everything stopped. A minute later, Dan kept asking Mike what had just happened, but I was too scared to stay in the room. I kept pacing between the hallway and the bedroom. None of us knew what to say. Eventually, we ran outside onto the front lawn, gasping for air. From outside, we could still see the lights inside flickering, and the radio was still playing erratic noise. Dan was panicked. This was his parents' room, and he was probably afraid they'd find out we had been messing around in there. After about 10 minutes, everything inside seemed to calm down. Mike looked completely shaken. He barely spoke. Maybe he was just in shock. Honestly, all of us were. In the end, Dan had to call Mike's mom to pick him up. I'll never forget the way Mike looked getting into that car. Terrified. He couldn't even look at us. That night, I cried in bed because I was too scared to sleep. Every little noise sent chills down my spine. The next morning, I waited for Mike outside of school. He looked like he didn't want to talk about it. So, being the goofball of our group, I joked, asking if he could set our football coach's car on fire with his new powers. He chuckled, and that made all of us feel a little better. A couple of weeks later, Mike was kicked off the team for something unrelated, though I don't remember exactly what. After that, we drifted apart, as kids often do. Dan and I remained friendly but ended up in different social circles by the time we graduated. We never really sat down and talked about what happened that night. Dan and I told a few people over the years, but most just dismissed it as nonsense. And since Mike had always played up his Johnny Blade persona, it made the story sound even less believable. I eventually stopped telling this story to others because it sounded too forced. I've shared it with my wife and a few people over the years, but since then, nothing strange has happened to me. At least not that I'm aware of. I'm not even sure if this qualifies as supernatural. It might have been more of a spiritual encounter. Unusual events in Wyoming from Sarah. As a child, I moved around a lot with my mom. My parents were divorced, and I had several experiences that took place close to one another, so I'll combine them into one story. Just a heads up, this contains a brief mention of self-harm. When I lived with my mom in a tiny, isolated town in Wyoming, the place had little more than 2 gas stations, a church, a school, a few bars, and some houses. We stayed in a home that I'm convinced was once haunted, if not still. The house wasn't big, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a second floor. It had both a front and backyard. I lived there for roughly 2 years, and throughout that time, I always had an eerie sensation of being watched, no matter where I was in the house. I've always been fascinated by the supernatural and occult, and back then, I used to play paranormal-related games. Over time, the feeling of being watched intensified into something worse. I felt like I was being stalked. I frequently spotted shadowy figures, which usually just stood there observing me. Occasionally, I would feel an icy touch on my shoulder or back. Despite this, I believed these shadowy beings didn't mean any harm, so I tried to ignore them, thinking that if I didn't acknowledge them, they would do the same. As time went on, things got worse. I became extremely paranoid, and the sensation of being watched became unbearable. I started waking up with faint, shallow scratches on my sides, near my stomach, and on my arms. My dogs didn't sleep in my bed, and this had never happened before, so I tried to come up with a reasonable explanation. Maybe I was scratching myself in my sleep, but at 15 years old, it didn't make sense. I had never done that before. My younger brother R and my stepbrother J also saw the shadowy figures from time to time. J saw them more frequently than R, which reassured me that I wasn't imagining things. These figures weren't just tricks of the light or something in my head. I would sometimes see them clearly, not just out of the corner of my eye. One morning, I got up and went to my closet. Inside my closet, there was a tiny door, kind of like the one in Coraline, which led to a small crawl space. When I looked closer, I noticed strange markings and faint carvings on the door, symbols and random letters that didn't form real words. I couldn't explain it. At that time, I didn't have anything sharp except scissors, as I had previously struggled with self-harm and wasn't allowed to have knives. Couldn't have been J or R either. My closet door was old and squeaky, and I always used a doorstop to keep it shut since the actual lock was on the outside. Even if someone tried to get in, I would have woken up from the noise. I also had no history of sleepwalking. Another night, I was outside in the front yard with Jay while my sister M and R had already gone to bed. The front and back yards were divided by a flimsy 3 to 4 foot chain link fence. I froze when I looked toward the back corner of the house, near the shed. From behind the house, I saw 3 figures leaning out, as if trying to watch us without being seen. I turned to Jay and asked, "Do you see that too?" While pointing at them, the figures looked like tall, dark silhouettes with large, glowing white or yellow eyes. Jay confirmed that he saw them as well. Panicked, we both ran inside immediately. I kept seeing the figures, sometimes outside the windows, as if they were staring into the house. I truly believe they were watching us. I never really had a family. My mom passed away after being disowned by her parents, and my dad spent most of his life cycling in and out of mental institutions before he finally ended it himself. The only blood relative I was aware of was my dad's older brother. But one of the few grim truths I knew about my family was that my uncle blamed himself for my father's death. Because of that, he had moved to a remote cabin deep in the forests of Vermont and had been living in isolation ever since. I had only a vague idea of where the cabin was, and even less interest in tracking him down. To me, he was as good as gone, just like my parents were. The truth is, I blamed him too. Having someone to direct my anger at, someone to hold responsible. It was the only thing that gave me any peace after such a miserable childhood. Against all odds, though, by the summer of 2017, I had built a life for myself in the Philadelphia area. I was the assistant manager of a craft brewery, had a cozy little apartment, and even went on a few dates every now and then. I was well on my way to putting my past behind me, and that felt better than I could ever put into words. Then the letter came. It was from a law office in Montpelier, Vermont, and as soon as I saw the state postmark, I had a sinking feeling about what it meant. Sure enough, the letter informed me that my uncle had passed away and that the attorney had been tasked with distributing his assets to any surviving family members. I had always assumed he didn't have much to his name, and I wasn't wrong about that. But that didn't mean he hadn't left something for me in his will. Annoyingly, I had to travel all the way to Montpelier to find out what it was. I called the attorney's office, lied about being too busy to make the trip, and asked outright what I had inherited. Imagine my surprise when the lawyer told me he had no clue. All he had was a key to a safety deposit box at a bank in town, and his job was to make sure I opened it and understood its significance. His only motivation, his payment was locked in the box, too. The whole thing felt like the setup for a bad thriller movie, and I only started to take it seriously when the lawyer assured me that he wasn't joking. A part of me wanted to ignore it entirely, to leave the past buried where it belonged. But peace of mind doesn't pay the bills, and as selfish as it sounds, if there was any money involved, I wanted my share. So, I took half a day off work one Friday in mid-July, the 14th or maybe the 16th, and made the 6-hour round trip to Montpelier. The drive was peaceful enough, but as I pulled up to the quaint little law office of Green and Fowler, an anxious knot tightened in my stomach. Somehow, I had convinced myself that all I'd find in that safety deposit box was some revelation so horrible it would undo all the progress I had made over the past several years. You can imagine my apprehension as I met with the attorney and accompanied him to Green Mountain Savings to unlock the box. By the time the bank manager led us into the secure room, my palms were damp with sweat. I cracked open the box, expecting some awful truth, but all I found was a bundle of cash and a single letter. The lawyer took his share of the money, but when it came time for me to read the letter, I hesitated. The attorney even asked if I wanted to be left alone, but instead, I made a strange request. I asked him to read it for me and summarize it as plainly as possible. I watched his face closely as he scanned the letter, and when his expression shifted to pure confusion, he simply handed it to me. It wasn't some long-winded apology, no heartfelt farewell, no explanation, just a series of numbers, which I quickly recognized as coordinates, followed by 3 words scrawled in jagged handwriting: "Burn it all." When the attorney asked if I knew what the coordinates meant, I didn't have a solid answer. But after a quick search on my phone, I was about 90% sure they pointed to his cabin in the woods. Whatever he wanted me to destroy was a mystery, but suddenly, my curiosity was overwhelming. My mind raced with theories about the disturbing, possibly illegal things my uncle had been involved in. If he had left behind something awful, I needed to see it for myself. I needed to destroy it. On the drive back to the law office, I asked the attorney how my uncle had died. He told me my uncle had driven himself to the hospital a week before he passed and had arranged the deposit box months in advance. As far as anyone knew, he had been completely alone in that cabin for years. Before I left, I asked the lawyer for advice. His words stuck with me. Sometimes, if you don't bury the past, it buries you. I made up my mind. I would drive out to the cabin, fulfill my uncle's final request, and destroy whatever was inside. At first light the next morning, I packed a gas can and some matches and made the 3-hour trip to the wilderness. The closer I got to the coordinates, the more uneasy I felt. The forest floor was littered with strange fungi, brain-like clumps of gyrometra mushrooms and red-stained devil's tooth. The deeper I went, the more frequently they appeared. By the time I spotted the decaying wooden structure through the trees, the air was thick with a sickly, rotting stench. The cabin was covered in fungus, growing from every crack and crevice. As I pulled the gas can from my pack, a disturbing thought crossed my mind. What if the fumes were flammable? I needed to be sure. So, against my better judgment, I pushed the door open. Inside, the humidity was unbearable. The walls were lined with decaying books and bizarre symbols scrawled across a blackboard. At the center of the room sat a massive pot on an old stove, tubes running from its opening, pumping out a rancid vapor. My uncle had been cooking something before he died, something that had been simmering ever since. The realization made me gag, and I stumbled outside, vomiting into the dirt. I had seen enough. Wrapping my shirt around my face, I doused the entire cabin in gasoline and struck a match. As the flames roared to life, I swore I could hear something in the fungi screaming. Driving home, I felt no relief, only more unanswered questions. I never saw any news reports about the fire, not a single mention. It was as if no one wanted to acknowledge what had been out there. I try not to think about it anymore. I've built a life for myself, and I won't let anything drag me back into the past. But if you ever find yourself deep in the Vermont woods and you start noticing too many of those strange mushrooms, do yourself a favor, turn around and walk away.